How do you analyze UCC 2207 and the mirror image rule on a contract's essay question? Remember, to form a traditional enforceable contract, there's going to be three requirements: offer, acceptance, and consideration. And thus far in our videos in contract law, we've been talking about the offer and acceptance, how a valid offer is formed and how that offer is accepted. And we talked about a lot of the issues that can arise from the time an offer is formed until it's eventually accepted. So we're almost done here. We just have one major issue left in the realm of offer and acceptance before we're ready to move on to consideration. And that's going to be the situation that arises when the offeree receives an offer, adds additional or different terms to that offer, and sends it back, whether that's verbally, orally, or on paper. This is going to trigger that situation where we have the offeree adding additional or different terms is going to trigger this situation. But let's just draw it on the board so we can all visualize it for a second. Imagine that we have an offeror who wants to draw up an offer sheet. So it doesn't matter what it is. It could be for the purchase and sale of dry erase markers. It could be for the purchase and sale of real estate. Let's not worry about what it actually is. Let's just imagine that we have this big offer sheet, a 20-page contract that's being sent to the offeree. So we have this, and this is my big offer sheet. I know, horrible artwork, but this is supposed to be an offer sheet, and that's sent to the offeree. So the offeree receives the offer sheet, and let's say that the offeree looks it over and decides it looks great, but he wants to make one tiny little change. So on the front page, he pulls out his pen, that's my pen, makes a little addendum at the top of the page, and he says, this shipment needs to be made by next Tuesday. He just writes that on the top page next to the little delivery clause. I'm sure there's a delivery spot somewhere on the front page, and so the offeree writes, make sure to ship this by next Tuesday. And then he sends it back. And he sends that offer sheet back, he signs it, sends it back, and he means for that to be an acceptance of the offer. But he has added an additional or different term, right, to the offer sheet. So the question in contract law is going to be whether, when he sends this back, is that communication an acceptance of the offer? Is it an acceptance of the offer? Or is it a counteroffer? And that's going to be the question we're going to explore today in this video. What happens in this situation? Is that an acceptance or is that a counteroffer? Well, we're going to find that the law treats this differently depending on whether we're dealing with a service or real estate contract and the common law applies, or if we're dealing with the purchase or sale of a good where the UCC applies. So for now, let's just start with our baseline and say the common law applies. So imagine that this is for the purchase or sale of real estate or land. So we know that the common law governs the contract. Well, the common law applies in this situation the mirror image rule. The mirror image rule. And the good news here is the mirror image rule is an extremely easy analysis to complete. All we have to do is look at the offer and the purported acceptance and ask, are they a mirror image of each other? The mirror image rule says in order for this communication that the offeree sends back to be an acceptance, it has to mirror the offer exactly. There can be no changes, right? So in this situation, under the mirror image rule, we are going to have a counteroffer, not an acceptance, because if we look at the offer and the purported acceptance, they are not a perfect mirror image of each other. The purported acceptance is adding additional or different terms. This guy wrote on the front page, this needs to be shipped by next Tuesday. When he did that, we no longer have a mirror image, right? Even though the other 20 pages or the other 19 pages of the contract are going to be a perfect mirror image, because he wrote that on the first page, even though it's a tiny, tiny little change, it doesn't matter. Any additional or different term added is going to break that mirror image. So it's going to be a counteroffer under the common law and the mirror image rule. Very easy analysis. All you have to say is basically, if any additional or different term is added to the deal, you know it's not an acceptance. It's a counteroffer. So common law is very easy. The problem with this, even though it's very easy to apply, is we can see that in a lot of situations, this might be an extremely harsh result, right? And as the common law evolved over years and more cases came up where we had, especially cases dealing with a situation like this between merchants, between business people, where we had these long purchase agreements being sent out and the acceptances being sent back might have minor changes on it that didn't even materially alter the deal, but because they were a little bit different under the mirror image rule in the common law, it was coming to a lot of harsh results, right? So what ended up happening is eventually the UCC comes along and says, you know what, a lot of people are getting the raw end of this deal. You know, it's not at all what the intent of the parties were, and it's allowing offerors to get out of the contract too easily just because a tiny little term was added. How is that going to be fair? So what ends up happening is the UCC comes along and comes up with this statute to address this exact issue, which is 207. This statute comes along and says, okay, in some situations, we're going to say for the purchase or sale of goods, even if you add additional or different terms, in some situations, we're going to say that's okay, it's still an acceptance. And that's all that 2207 is dealing with. How do we determine whether it's an acceptance or a counteroffer, and what do we do from there? Okay, so let's just jump into 2207. 2207 has 3 subparts. So you have 2207-1, you have 2207-1, 2207-2, and you have 2207-3. And each one of these subsections is dealing with a different issue, right? So 2207-1 is going to deal with your baseline start of the analysis, which is this exact question. Is the purported acceptance, is this communication being sent back by the offeree with additional or different terms, is that an acceptance or counteroffer? Acceptance or counteroffer. That is what UCC 2207-1 is dealing with. UCC 2207-2, and the step 2 of the analysis comes along and says, okay, if we find that this purported acceptance being communicated back to the offeror is actually an acceptance, now it's got additional or different terms, what terms govern the contract? We have an original offer and a new acceptance that have different terms. How do we know what terms govern the contract? So UCC 2207-2 asks the question, what terms control? What terms control? Is it the additional or different terms? Is it the original terms? Does the UCC need to come in and add gap fillers? Remember, we discussed this in a prior video. Remember when we were talking about the price term under the UCC? We said in a UCC contract for a purchase sale of good, sometimes you don't even need to include the price term because the UCC is willing to plug the gaps and come up with a fair price for you. So remember, the UCC is very flexible and we can add in gap fillers where we need. So under UCC 2207-2, once we've said that these additional or different terms that were added are a part of the acceptance, it still constitutes an acceptance rather. What terms control? Well, it could be the original terms, it could be the new or additional terms, or the UCC can come in with gap fillers, right? So there's lots of options there, and we're going to discuss what 2207-2 says, and it's actually really easy. Okay, and finally 2207-3 is kind of its own beast, right? It deals with a almost entirely separate issue that can occur, but what happens here, and very briefly on 2207-3, would be the situation where we actually find that the purported acceptance is a counteroffer. So there was never a contract to begin with, so no contract. So we never had a contract to begin with, but let's say that the parties perform like there is a contract, okay? So in this situation, we find, okay, this was actually a counteroffer that was sent back. So the parties never had a valid contract, but they performed like there was one. Well, 22073 says in this unique situation, what we're going to do is we're going to say even though there was never a contract to begin with, because they performed like there was one, we're going to take that original offer and that purported acceptance that was really a counteroffer, we're going to compare those two things, and any overlapping terms are going to become part of a new agreement, a new contract that we're going to impose on the parties. And if there's any missing terms, we're going to use UCC gap fillers to plug it in. So under 22073, it's kind of just like Frankensteining together a contract in this rare situation where there was never a contract, but the parties performed like there was one anyways. But we're not going to worry for today in this video, we're not going to worry too much about 22073. It's its own beast, like I said before, and really most of the time that 2207 is being tested on a contracts essay, you're going to be dealing with subsection 1 and 2, not subsection 3. Okay, but let's go ahead and jump into it. Let's go back to 22071. How do we determine whether this, when this is communicated back, when the offeree receives that offer sheet and sends it back, how do we know if it's an acceptance or a counteroffer? Well, UCC 22071 states that a definite or seasonable expression of acceptance or written confirmation that it's sent within a reasonable amount of time operates as an acceptance even though it states terms additional or different to those that were agreed upon, so long as or unless, and this is the key, unless the acceptance is expressly conditioned on the offeror's assent to the additional or different terms. So I know that was a mouthful. All that it's basically saying, all UCC 22071 is saying, cutting through the exact language of the statute, is we're going to allow the offeree to add some additional or different terms. That's fine, and it can still be an acceptance unless the acceptance is expressly conditioned on the offeror's assent to the additional or different terms. So, the easy example here is, imagine that I offer to sell you this dry erase marker for $5. And you say, it's a deal, I accept, on the condition that you lower the price to $4. Under the UCC, that is a counteroffer because your acceptance is conditioned on my assent to the additional or different terms. You're saying it's a deal if on the condition that you assent to this new price term. You're forcing me, the offeror, to agree to the new term in order for us to have a valid acceptance. Now compare that to this situation. Compare that to a situation where you send over a 20-page offer sheet and the offeree just adds a tiny little sentence on the front page and sends it back. The offeree is not making this an express condition that the offeror must assent to. He's just writing it on the front and sending it back. Nowhere in this contract is he writing, you must, offeror, agree to this new condition that I'm adding in. So in that situation, under UCC 2071, it's going to be an acceptance. Okay, and the general rule here is you want to look for that conditional language because it has to be expressly made, right? It can't be inferred from the conduct. It's got to be expressed. So you want to look for conditional language. When the additional or different terms are added, are they preceded by some sort of conditional language? It says something along the lines of, you offeror must accept these new terms, right? On the condition that you agree to these new terms. If that was added, then of course it's going to be a counteroffer. But if you just add something, you just write a little thing like ship by next Tuesday, you're not expressly making it conditional that the offeror assent to what you're adding. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And that's really the only requirement, right? UCC 22071 says all that stuff, a definite and seasonable expression of acceptance or a written confirmation that's sent within a reasonable amount of time operates as an acceptance, even though it states terms additional to or different from those offered or agreed upon, unless and then it breaks down this exception we've just talked about. So on a contracts essay, you'll really want to write down that whole statute, right? And I'll put that below so everyone can see it. But the main idea is really going to come down to the acceptance and the conditional nature. You just want to look at the additional or different terms, whether it's being communicated verbally or on paper. You want to find those additional or different terms. Look before those additional terms. Was any conditional language used? Did the offeree say that the offeror must assent to these new terms? If so, it's a counteroffer, not an acceptance, okay? So that's UCC 2207-1. 2207-2 comes along and says, what terms control? So if we find that this is an acceptance, right? So the offeree adds this little additional term, shipped by next Tuesday. If we find that that is an acceptance under the counteroffer, which I think we would in this situation I laid out originally, the next question is going to be, do these additional or different terms that were added control? This clause about shipping by next Tuesday, does that become part of the contract, or are we going to implement UCC gap fillers? By the way, the original terms are out. Just to tell you as a starting point, you don't have to worry about the original terms. The question is going to be whether the additional or different terms that were added by the offeree come in and become part of the contract, or are we going to plug in UCC gap fillers? And the answer is actually super easy. If the offeror and the offeree, if this guy and this guy are both merchants, then the additional or different terms become part of the contract. The additional or different terms control unless one of three exceptions applies that's laid out in 2207-2. So the additional or different terms, if both parties are merchants, your starting point rule is the additional or different terms control unless one of three exceptions applies that's laid out in UCC 2207-2. And those exceptions are going to be if both parties are merchants, the additional or different terms control unless the offer expressly limits acceptance to the terms of the offer. So when this offer was sent, right, and this contract, anywhere in this contract, if the offeror included that language, if the offeror said that the terms, your acceptance is expressly limited to these terms, if the offeror included that in the original contract, that these are the express conditions and you can't change them, right? It's limited to these exact conditions I'm laying out. If that's included in the original offer and then the offeree adds additional terms, even though they're both merchants, it's still going to be UCC gap fillers being implemented because that's our first exception under UCC 2207-2. So if both parties are merchants, but in the original offer sheet that got sent over, the offeror actually expressly limited the acceptance to the terms included in the original offer, then UCC 2207-2 says under that exception, UCC gap fillers are going to be implemented. These additional or different terms are not going to control. The other two exceptions are really easy. If the new or additional terms that are added, even if both parties are merchants, okay, say both parties are merchants, but the additional or different terms that were added materially alter the deal, then we're going to say UCC gap fillers have to be implemented. We're not going to let additional or different terms that materially alter the deal govern the contract. So imagine in this, the offeree changes the price term, cuts the price term in half. That materially alters the deal. We're not going to let that additional or different term fly. We're going to plug in UCC gap fillers to determine a fair price, right? So UCC 2207-2 also says as your third exception, so even if both parties are merchants, but the offeror objects to the new additional or different terms within a reasonable amount of time, then UCC gap fillers are going to be implemented. So those are your three exceptions under UCC 2207-2. Your starting point rule is if both parties are merchants, then the additional or different terms control. If either party is not a merchant, then UCC gap fillers will be implemented. But then again, remember under UCC 22072, we do have those 3 exceptions. So even if both parties are merchants, it's not conclusive if the offer is expressly limited, right? If the acceptance in this offer, we're limiting the acceptance expressly to the terms included in this original offer, then the UCC gap fillers are going to be implemented, even if both parties are merchants, or if the new terms materially alter the deal, or if the offeror objects in a reasonable amount of time. Even if both parties are merchants, in any of those situations, gap fillers are going to be implemented. Okay, guys? That's UCC 2207 in a nutshell. That's the mirror image rule. Remember, mirror image rule, you just look at both sides of the deal. If there's any difference, right, any additional or different terms, then you don't have a perfect mirror image. It's a counter offer, not an acceptance. No problem. UCC 2207 comes along and says, let's make this a little bit softer. Let's soften that blow a little bit. Let's allow some additional or different terms to come in. Remember, that was 22071. It's going to discuss whether you have an acceptance or counteroffer. Once you determine it is an acceptance under 22071, the next question is going to be, what terms control? Do the additional or different terms control, or do we have to plug in UCC gap fillers? Okay, one final note, and then we're going to be done with this, I promise, is that in some jurisdictions, in a majority of jurisdictions, which is why I bring this up, some jurisdictions and a majority have said, don't worry about 22072. Okay, they've made a distinction between additional and different terms. And they're saying if we're dealing with different terms, we're not going to apply 22072. We're going to apply the knockout rule. So they make a distinction between additional and different terms, and they say if we have different terms, we're going to apply the knockout rule. And we're not going to worry about 22072, and we're just going to say if you're adding different terms, the terms in the original offer and the new offer knock each other out, and we plug in UCC gap fillers. So we don't care about this whole merchant thing. UCC 22072 is out. Let's put in the knockout rule. For different terms, for additional terms, we're going to keep it the exact same. We're going to go to 22072 exactly as it is. That's just one tiny nuance for you guys at the very end. If you have some extra time and you really want to rack up every possible point, you can look for the knockout rule if you're dealing with a different term being added. And of course, the difference between additional terms and different terms is easy. Additional terms is like this example where you're actually adding something that wasn't there before. A different term would be changing something. So you're changing the price from $20 per unit to $19 per unit. That's a different term. You're actually changing something. Some jurisdictions will go with the knockout rule. They don't care about 22072, whether the parties are merchants or not, and they're just going to say knockout rule, kill the term in the original and in the new, and knock each other out and just plug in gap fillers. But that's everything that we need to know, guys, for 2207. With that, I will leave you all to it. In our next video, we can finally move on to consideration. I'm excited to get past offer and acceptance. Until then, guys, I wish you all the absolute best. I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you at our next video.